When I had a stroke, my son said, "Just stay with US until you get better." 2 nights later, I was freezing in their garage, watching my breath turn to mist. I heard them through the wall. "If she slips up, we file for guardianship and take it all." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just reached for the smartwatch Lily gave me and hit record. Their voices would be the last thing they ever took from me. Margaret Ellis hadn't always been this fragile. Just 3 weeks ago, she was tending to her back garden, organizing old court records from her days as a legal clerk and making rhubarb pie from scratch. She had worked over 30 years in the county courthouse, knew every judge by name, and still kept her mind sharp with crossword puzzles and mystery novels. Then came the mild stroke. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. She collapsed in her kitchen, a coffee mug shattering on the floor. The EMTs told her she was lucky. There was no paralysis, just some speech slurring and fatigue. She was discharged in 3 days. Her son Brian insisted she move in with him and Kendra, just for a few weeks to recover. Margaret had hesitated. Her little cottage in Burlington wasn't grand, but it was hers. But she was tired, still shaky, and Brian had sounded so caring on the phone. "We'll take care of you, Mom. We want to help." And so she let him. The first red flag came when Kendra barely made eye contact the day she arrived. Brian rolled in a small suitcase for her, then gave her a brief side hug. "We cleared the back room for you," he'd said. But it wasn't a room. It was the garage. No windows. No heating. Just a folding cot, a space heater too weak to fight the February chill, and a dusty pile of tools and bins pressed against the walls. "I thought, maybe the guest room?" Margaret said quietly. Kendra didn't look up from her phone. "It's full of storage. This is temporary. We'll sort something out later." Brian rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding her gaze. "Yeah, just a few nights, Mom." So she nodded, forcing a small smile, though her heart felt squeezed. That night, she didn't sleep. The cold was unbearable. Her breath formed small clouds, her hands cramped from the chill. Every creak of the walls reminded her she was not home, not wanted. By morning, her back ached and her fingers were stiff. She shuffled inside to the kitchen, only to hear Kendra mutter, "She's already up? It's barely 6. Brian cleared his throat. "She's old. Old people don't sleep much." Margaret stood there silently, their voices cutting through her like frost. No one offered her breakfast. No one asked how she was. The second night was worse. Her joints throbbed from the cold. She pulled the thin blanket tighter, blinking back tears. She tried to read, but her fingers were too cold to turn the pages. Just after midnight, she heard them. They were in the kitchen, talking low, but the garage door wasn't thick enough. "She's not all there anymore," Kendra whispered. "Did you hear how she forgot where her charger was today? Classic sign. You know what the lawyer said? If she shows signs of cognitive decline, we can start guardianship proceedings." Brian's voice was quieter, nervous. "Do we really want to go that far? Are you kidding? That house of hers is worth over $300K. We get control, we sell it, and we don't have to worry about nursing homes or any of this crap." Margaret didn't move. She stared up at the cobwebbed ceiling, frozen in place. Her heart pounded in her ears. Guardianship? Take everything? She lay there for another hour, staring into the dark. Then she remembered something. Lily. Her granddaughter had visited just a few weeks earlier. Before the stroke. A sweet, bright girl in her early 20s with a kind heart. For Christmas, she'd given Margaret a small smartwatch. "So you can track your steps, Grandma. And I programmed it to record voice memos too, in case you ever want to note your memories." Margaret's fingers trembled as she reached over to the little charging dock beside the cot. Thank God it was fully charged. She tapped through the menu until she found the record feature. She slipped it onto her wrist, just in time to catch Kendra say, "If we do it soon, she'll be too weak to fight it. She's practically invisible already." The tears didn't come that night. Only silence. In the morning, Margaret pretended everything was fine. She smiled at Brian, who avoided her eyes. She nodded at Kendra, who told her to try not to use too much hot water. But that evening, while they were out, she called someone. Francis Bowman. He was an old friend, a retired attorney who had once helped her with her will. She hadn't spoken to him in years, but his number hadn't changed. "Francis," she said softly into the phone, "I need a favor, and I need someone who still believes I matter." He didn't hesitate. "Margaret, where are you?" "I'm in a garage. I've been here for 2 nights. And I think my son is trying to take everything from me." The next day, Francis showed up. He brought with him a retired Judge Margaret once worked with, Judge Pamela Avery. A tough, brilliant woman in her 70s who hadn't forgotten Margaret's decades of loyal service in the court. Judge Avery hugged her gently. "You don't look confused to me, Margaret." Margaret chuckled bitterly. "No one ever does, unless they're trying to make you disappear." They listened to the recordings. Frances took notes. Judge Avery's mouth tightened into a line. "We'll file immediately," she said. "Emergency elder abuse petition, request for a restraining order, and immediate asset freeze." "But they're my family," Margaret whispered. Judge Avery nodded solemnly. "And they're also your abusers." Frances gave her a gentle squeeze on the arm. "You are not alone. Not this time." The filings moved fast. Judge Avery had friends in the right places, and Margaret's years of spotless civil service didn't go unnoticed. Within 2 days, they had a court order in hand. When Brian and Kendra returned that night, Margaret was sitting calmly at the kitchen table. She wore a clean sweater. Her shoulders were straighter than they'd been in days. Kendra looked startled. "Why are you in here?" Margaret stood slowly, her eyes unwavering. "I'm here to give you this." She handed them 2 envelopes. Brian opened his first. His face went white. "What is this?" "A restraining order," Margaret said quietly. "You are no longer allowed to manage my affairs, enter my home, or attempt to act as my guardian. Any attempts will be considered legal harassment and coercion." Kendra opened hers. Her jaw clenched. "This is insane. She's not right in the head." "Oh," Margaret said, tilting her head. "Then I suppose this recording of you talking about selling my house must have been a hallucination?" She tapped her smartwatch. The room went silent. Brian looked like he might faint. "I'm leaving tonight," Margaret continued. "My lawyer and the court have arranged a safe apartment nearby. You won't see me again, but you'll hear from my attorney." As she turned to leave, she paused. "I gave you everything. I raised you alone after your father died, and I did it with pride. But you've made it clear that what I gave wasn't enough for you." Kendra scoffed. "Oh, please, this is just revenge." "No," Margaret said, her voice firmer than it had been in years. "This is justice." The new apartment was nothing like the home Margaret Ellis had lived in for 40 years, but it was warm, clean, and hers. The space was modest, a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a quiet senior housing complex in South Burlington. The walls were painted a soft cream, the windows faced a cluster of pine trees, and the carpet smelled faintly of lavender. Her name was already on the mailbox. Francis had driven her there himself, carrying her small suitcase and the few essentials she had salvaged from Brian's garage. Judge Avery had pulled a few strings to expedite placement through a local elder care advocate she knew. Within 72 hours, Margaret had a key, a lease in her name, and peace she hadn't felt in weeks. As the door clicked shut behind her, she leaned against it and exhaled. She was safe. And she was alone. For a long time, she just stood there, letting her breath steady. Her fingers brushed over the edge of the small kitchen counter. No one shouting. No cold air sneaking under the door. No whispers through the wall plotting to erase her. She was free, but not yet whole. That night, she slept for the first time in 3 days. No nightmares. No voices. Just silence. When she woke, the sun was rising over the pines. She made herself oatmeal and tea, and sat in the kitchen nook by the window. For the first time in her life, she wondered, what happens now when your own child betrays you? She pulled out her old notebook and began to write. February 14th. Today I start over. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm 75 years old. And I will not be erased. Francis stopped by later that afternoon. He brought more good news. Temporary order went through. The court froze all your assets until we finish the investigation. Brian can't touch a penny. Margaret raised her eyebrows. And the house? Protected. You're still the sole legal owner. The court is dispatching a home evaluator to check for signs of neglect or manipulation. Once the restraining order becomes permanent, we can file for formal eviction. Margaret nodded, her hand gripping the warm mug of chamomile. I don't want revenge, she said quietly. But I want them out. Francis studied her face. You don't have to explain yourself to me. I just keep asking how we got here. He was such a good boy once. Francis leaned forward, voice gentle. You didn't fail him, Margaret. He failed you. A week passed. Margaret began a new routine. Slow walks through the hallways, daily tea at the window, and once a week, therapy through a local elder support program. She didn't speak much in the first session, but in the second, she told the therapist everything. About Brian, the garage, the cold. About hearing her own son say she was already halfway gone. The therapist listened with full attention. Then she said something that stuck with Margaret. Neglect is a form of violence, and silence is its accomplice. You broke the silence. That takes extraordinary strength. Margaret cried then, quiet, aching tears that had been frozen inside her. She didn't cry because she was broken. She cried because she had survived. 3 weeks later, the judge granted a permanent restraining order against Brian and Kendra. The financial audit revealed attempts to access Margaret's bank accounts and suspicious inquiries into the value of her house. The court appointed a temporary trustee to protect her assets until everything was settled. Margaret returned to her house with an officer and the court representative. Kendra was furious. Brian didn't say a word. She served them both the eviction order and walked through the house she hadn't seen in over a month. It smelled like mildew and stale coffee. In the living room, a pile of mail sat unopened. Her bedroom door was locked. When the court rep asked for the key, Kendra rolled her eyes and handed it over. Inside, Margaret's dresser had been rifled through. Jewelry missing. Framed photos turned face down. She picked one up and turned it over. It was her and Brian. He was 8 years old, holding her hand outside his elementary school. He was smiling. She wasn't sure who that boy had become. The story made the local news. A 75-year-old woman forced to sleep in a garage by her son and daughter-in-law? Secret recordings? Legal retaliation? Reporters camped outside the courthouse during the eviction hearing. Margaret declined interviews at first. She didn't want the world's pity. But Lily, her granddaughter, had other thoughts. She came to visit one chilly March afternoon, her backpack slung over one shoulder and eyes wide with concern. "Grandma," she said, holding her hand, "you have no idea how many people are going through this." Margaret's eyes softened. "You found out?" Lily nodded. "Dad tried to say you were losing your mind. But I remembered the watch. I checked your message history. And then, I found the clip." She looked up, eyes wet. "I'm so sorry I didn't come sooner." Margaret smiled gently and cupped her hand. "You came when it mattered." Lily helped set up a small blog called Justice in Silence. It started as a place to post Margaret's story, the legal documents, and resources for others experiencing elder abuse. But in just a few weeks, the blog exploded. Dozens of emails poured in. "My daughter-in-law locked me in my room. My son tells people I'm senile, so he can control my bank account. No one believes me, but I know I'm not crazy." Margaret read them all. Every message felt like a mirror. She began responding to as many as she could. Francis noticed. "You know," he said over tea one afternoon, "you might have something here." "A mission?" she asked. "A movement," he said. By April, Margaret had filed paperwork to register Justice in Silence as a nonprofit. With Francis as legal counsel and Lily managing the digital presence, they secured a small grant from a Vermont Elder Advocacy Foundation. They created printable guides. How to legally document elder abuse. How to file emergency guardianship opposition. How to find allies in your community. They even hosted a virtual seminar. Margaret, nervous but determined, read her prepared statement slowly and clearly, her hands only trembling once. "I believed that love would protect me. I believed that family meant safety. But I was wrong. Love is not a license to hurt. Family does not give anyone the right to erase your dignity. I speak today for the thousands of voices that remain silent, not because they are weak, but because they believe no one will listen. I'm here to say, we hear you." The screen filled with clapping icons. Dozens of elder viewers wiped their eyes. Still, at night, the wounds ached. Margaret sometimes dreamed she was back in the garage. She would wake up, heart pounding, cold air clawing at her memory. She'd sit up, touch the edge of the blanket, and whisper to herself, "You're not there anymore. You're safe." On the second Sunday of April, Lily surprised her with a small gift. A framed photo. It showed Margaret standing outside the courthouse, documents in hand, her shoulders back, her chin high. Below it, a small plaque read. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She endured. And then she rose. Margaret stared at it for a long time. Then she smiled. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt proud. The courtroom was packed. Not with lawyers and jury members, but with something rarer, journalists, elder rights activists, and quiet strangers holding signs that read, "I believe Margaret. Justice for elders. We deserve warmth, not garages." It was May now. Spring had softened the Vermont air, but Margaret Ellis still wore a cardigan to the courthouse. She didn't trust the weather, or people, to stay kind. The hearing wasn't about eviction anymore. It was about permanent guardianship fraud, attempted coercion, and psychological neglect. Brian and Kendra arrived with a new attorney, visibly agitated. The press coverage had painted them as villains, but their lawyer insisted they had been misunderstood caregivers, simply trying to help. But the audio recordings told another story. So did the financial records, the bedroom locks, the lack of heating in a garage occupied during freezing nights. And Margaret's consistent, coherent, composed testimony shattered any claims of confusion. The judge, an experienced man with snowy eyebrows and a steel gaze, didn't take long. In the matter of Ms. Margaret Ellis versus Mr. Brian Ellis and Ms. Kendra Ellis, he said, this court finds evidence of elder neglect, coercion, and attempted financial exploitation. All previous temporary restrictions are hereby made permanent. He looked directly at Margaret then, not with pity, but respect. Ms. Ellis, the court acknowledges your clarity, strength, and courage in the face of betrayal. Your story has not only protected you, it has protected many. She gave a small nod. Her hands were steady in her lap. Brian looked stunned. Kendra looked furious. The judge continued. Any further contact by the defendants will be considered a violation of this order and pursued accordingly. It was done. Margaret stood, shoulders square. The room around her felt like an ocean rising in applause, even in silence. She had not just won a case. She had reclaimed her name. That night, back at her apartment, Margaret sat at her writing desk and pulled out her journal. She didn't write a blog post or legal document. She wrote 3 letters. Letters she had drafted a dozen times in her mind, but never sent. One for Brian. One for Kendra. One for Lily. She didn't intend to mail the first 2. But they needed to be written. Letter to Brian. You were the light of my life. Your father died young, and I raised you with everything I had. Every lunch packed, every winter coat bought, every late-night drive when you called me from the highway, I gave willingly. I never asked for repayment. I only hoped, when I grew old, that you'd see me still as your mother. Not as a burden. Not as a wallet with legs. I don't know when your heart changed. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was convenience. But when you left me in that garage, you didn't just take my warmth. You took the illusion that love alone is enough. I will always love the boy you were. But I grieve the man you became. Letter to Kendra. I never asked for your affection. Only respect. I suspect you saw me as competition. One more person to divide Brian's attention. But you miscalculated. I was never trying to control him. Only to be part of the life I helped create. What you did to me was cruel, but not clever. Because women like me? We survive. We've survived husbands who drank, jobs that paid half as much, and decades of being talked over. A cold garage doesn't scare me. But a cold soul, that's far more dangerous. I hope one day you look at yourself with the honesty I had to muster just to leave. Letter to Lily. My darling girl. You saved me. That watch you gave me? It wasn't just a gadget. It was a lifeline. You believed in me when others chose to doubt. You remind me of myself when I was young, sharp, curious, but kinder than I ever was. Whatever road life takes you down, promise me this. Never let anyone make you feel small. You carry the voice of every woman who has been silenced. Use it boldly. And when people say you're too much, smile. Because they're used to women like us being quiet. She folded the letters neatly and placed them in a drawer. The one for Lily, she planned to give her in person. The others could stay unread. They were not for reconciliation. They were her way of letting go. 3 days later, Margaret received an email from a woman in Missouri. I saw your video. I'm 81. My daughter has my checkbook. I haven't been allowed to leave the house in weeks. Could you help? She replied immediately, connected the woman to a legal advocate, and followed up after 2 days. The woman was safe. That night, Margaret looked out at the stars from her window. Something inside her had shifted. No longer just a survivor, she was becoming a protector. One afternoon, she received a package with no return address. Inside was a box of lemon tea, a handwritten note, and a single photo. The note read, I know it's too late, but I needed to say I'm sorry. For believing her. For standing by and doing nothing. I left. She's not with me anymore. I'm in counseling. I hope you're well. Brian. Margaret sat with the letter for a long time. She didn't cry. But she didn't throw it away either. She placed it in the same drawer as the unsent letters, beside a pressed white lily from her granddaughter's last visit. By early summer, Justice in Silence had a network of volunteers. Retired lawyers, therapists, even a few nurses joined to assist with evaluations and home check-ins. They launched a monthly newsletter. Margaret appeared on a regional news segment. Her calm, deliberate voice, full of dignity and gravity, reached more people than she ever imagined. One of the closing lines of the segment went viral. If they try to put you in the dark, remember, even a spark is enough to start a fire. She had been the spark, and yet loneliness lingered. Some evenings felt heavier than others. Despite everything she'd built, there were still moments where she missed simple things. A voice calling Mom. A birthday card from Brian. A Sunday phone call just to ask if she needed groceries. Some losses are too invisible to grieve publicly. She never spoke about those aches. But they sat with her at the window every evening like old friends who refused to leave. She didn't chase them away. She simply acknowledged them. Then one Saturday in June, Lily surprised her again. This time with someone in tow. "Grandma, this is Marie," Lily said. "She's studying social work and helped us on the last hotline call. We've started working on a university partnership for Justice in Silence." Margaret raised her brows. "Are you telling me I have a team now?" Marie smiled warmly. "A small one, but growing." Margaret chuckled. "Be careful. I'll put you both to work." Lily grinned. "We're counting on it." The three of them sat down for tea and talked about expanding the program, setting up a 24/7 helpline, offering workshops for adult children on how to care without controlling, and training seniors to recognize the red flags of financial and emotional abuse. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a legacy. That night, Margaret stood at her window, holding a fresh cup of tea. The air was warm, summer just beginning to bloom in the trees below. Her mind wandered, not to the garage or the betrayal, but to her granddaughter's laughter, to the soft tap of a keyboard as Lily built their website, to the letters she'd written and the people she'd helped. She was still a mother, still a grandmother. But now she was something else too, an architect of something better. And she wasn't finished yet. Margaret Ellis never returned to her old home after the eviction was finalized. Though she still legally owned the property, she had no desire to step foot inside again. The rooms were full of ghosts, not the kind that haunted you at night, but the kind that spoke through the walls, whispered through doorways, and smiled while they erased you. The house sat locked and quiet on the edge of a sleepy Burlington street. The court arranged for the locks to be changed and her belongings to be gathered and transported to her apartment, those that hadn't been sold or stolen. Some heirlooms were gone forever. She didn't ask where they had gone. She didn't want to know. Instead, she kept what mattered most: a few old photo albums, a quilt her mother had made, and the small ceramic angel Lily had painted when she was 7. The rest was just furniture and time. One rainy evening in late June, Margaret was invited to speak at a community elder care forum in Montpelier. She wore her usual modest gray blouse, a pair of sturdy shoes, and the pearl earrings that had quietly survived every betrayal. As she stepped onto the stage, the lights felt warm on her skin. She didn't have a script, just a heart full of memory. She spoke of love twisted into silence, of just for a few nights becoming a sentence with no end, of freezing air and folding cots, of how being forgotten doesn't begin in a garage. It begins the moment someone decides your voice is no longer worth listening to. Her words weren't theatrical. They were steady, deliberate, like footsteps walking out of shame. At the end of her talk, a man in the second row stood up. He looked to be in his 60s. His voice trembled. "My mother's been living in our basement. We told her it was just until we fixed her apartment, but it's been 9 months. I didn't think we were doing something wrong." Margaret didn't scold. She nodded gently. "It's not about where she sleeps," she said. "It's about whether you see her when she walks in the room." Later that night, a volunteer handed her a sealed envelope. Margaret opened it when she returned to her apartment. Inside was a handwritten note in elegant cursive. "My name is Grace. I'm 82. My niece has taken my car keys and says I'm a danger to myself. I've never been in an accident. I don't know how to leave. Can you help?" Margaret folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. She had been Grace once. That night, she called Francis. "We need another pro bono slot this week." He chuckled. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." Lily visited more often that summer. Sometimes they'd sit on the porch, talking about website updates and the growing waitlist for legal help. Other times, they'd say nothing at all. One evening, Lily asked a question that caught Margaret off guard. Do you miss him? Margaret knew who she meant. She didn't answer right away. I miss the idea of him, she said finally. The version I held onto too long. The boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and stories about recess. Lily nodded, her voice quiet. It's hard, isn't it? Loving someone who stopped being good to you. Margaret smiled sadly. Harder still is forgiving yourself for not noticing sooner. In July, a woman named Anita came into Margaret's life. Anita was 76, a retired teacher, and recently displaced after her daughter sold her condo behind her back. She'd been living in a motel for weeks before finding justice in silence. Margaret met her at a coffee shop to talk. They ended up sitting for nearly 3 hours. Anita had a dry wit and a sharp mind. Her anger was palpable, but so was her grief. They say I'm ungrateful, Anita muttered, sipping her tea. After everything I did for them. Now I'm a drain. A problem. You'd think raising 3 kids alone would earn you a damn living room. Margaret leaned in, her voice low. You're not ungrateful. You're unappreciated. For the first time in days, Anita smiled. They began to meet weekly. Not for therapy, just for company. They went to library book readings, made each other soup, and laughed like schoolgirls over a failed attempt at yoga for seniors. It wasn't romance. It was something deeper. Recognition. A mirror that didn't distort. Margaret found herself writing again, filling pages with thoughts she hadn't dared let surface. The garage wasn't the coldest place. The coldest place was watching your child look through you and seeing nothing. Feeling invisible while still breathing. That's what nearly undid me. One morning, Margaret woke to find a bouquet at her door. Wildflowers. No note. She thought it was from Lily. Until a few days later, another bouquet arrived. This time tulips. Then a small envelope, tucked between the stems. I'm proud of you. A friend. Margaret held the card like a secret she wasn't sure she wanted to unfold. But she smiled, because for the first time in months, she didn't feel alone in the quiet hours. In mid-July, the Justice in Silence team hosted its first in-person workshop in Burlington. It was a modest affair, held in a church basement with folding chairs, homemade muffins, and coffee served in styrofoam cups. But the room was full. 30 elders. 10 volunteers. 1 microphone. Margaret stood at the front and told them what she knew. She told them that being forgotten was not their fault. That love should never come with silence and shame. That you don't have to scream to be strong. And that the world needs them. Still. Always. As she stepped down from the stage, a woman rushed forward and embraced her. Her name was Carla. She had escaped an emotionally abusive daughter-in-law who manipulated her into signing over her bank account. Your story saved me, she whispered. Margaret squeezed her hand. No, your voice saved you. I just reminded you it was still there. That night, Margaret wrote again. She wasn't sure what she was creating anymore. Journal entries, essays, maybe one day a book. But this line stayed with her. Cold doesn't always come with winter. Sometimes it arrives in the shape of a voice saying, it's just for a little while. The next morning, she found another bouquet. This time lilies. And a note that simply read, I heard you speak. You reminded me who I was. No signature. But Margaret didn't need one. Whoever it was, stranger or friend, they had understood something vital. That every word she had spoken came not from anger, but from survival. From knowing what it meant to be silenced, and what it takes to speak again. The last place Margaret Ellis ever expected to hear from again was the hospital. It was a warm August morning when her phone rang. She was folding laundry, nothing grand, just her usual gray blouse, a cardigan, socks she'd mended twice already, when the old-fashioned ringtone broke the silence. She looked at the caller ID and froze. Unknown number. Her instinct told her to ignore it. But something deeper, something weary and curious, compelled her to pick up. Hello. A long pause. Then a familiar voice. Raspy. Measured. And deeply uncomfortable. Mom. It's Brian. She didn't speak at first. She wasn't angry, just stunned. Not by the voice, but by how it felt inside her chest. Like someone had knocked on a door that had long since been locked, its key buried under months of healing. I didn't expect to hear from you, she said finally. His reply came slow. I didn't expect to call. Margaret walked to the chair by the window and sat down. The light was golden gentle. She rested her palm against the table. Is something wrong? He hesitated. I'm in the hospital. She felt her heart shift, but didn't let it rush. Not yet. For what? Chest pains. They think it was a mild attack. I'm fine. But it scared me. Margaret closed her eyes. For a moment, she imagined herself at his bedside, smoothing back his hair like she did when he was little. But that mother, that version of her, had been broken one garage night at a time. He continued, I've been reading your articles. Watching the videos. She waited. I don't expect anything. I needed to tell you I was sorry. I know that doesn't mean much after everything. Margaret stayed silent for a long while. Then she said with quiet finality, Brian, I forgave you the day I stopped needing you to say sorry. He exhaled, a strange sound, like grief mixed with relief. I hope you're okay, he said. I am, she replied. I really am. And then she hung up. Margaret sat there for a long time, listening to the hum of her apartment. The call hadn't broken her. It had clarified her. Forgiveness wasn't an open door. It was a boundary you built so that someone else's fire couldn't reach your skin again. That night, she wrote in her journal, healing isn't linear. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it sounds like your son's voice calling from a hospital, and the most powerful thing you do is not let it undo you. The following week, Justice in Silence was invited to speak at a national elder care conference in Chicago. Margaret hesitated at first. She had never been on a plane, never spoken to more than 50 people in one room. She still remembered the shiver in her bones the first time she sat in a courtroom, just weeks after sleeping on a cot surrounded by rakes and dusty paint cans. But Lily urged her. People need your voice, Grandma. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest. So she said yes. The flight was strange, metal wings and humming engines, but Margaret felt oddly calm. She looked out the window and thought about how high she had climbed in the past months. Not in miles, but in something deeper. Dignity. The kind you rebuild yourself, one brave step at a time. The conference hall was massive. Rows of tables, booths from advocacy groups, bright lights, microphone feedback. Margaret stepped onto the stage in her gray blouse, her pearl earrings glinting under the lights. She didn't bring a speech, just her story. And when she reached the part about the garage, the crowd didn't just listen. They held their breath. She ended with this. I was not helpless. I was unseen. And now I make sure others are seen too. The standing ovation wasn't loud. It was long. A deep, collective recognition of a truth most didn't want to admit. That elder abuse doesn't always come with bruises. Sometimes it comes with a folded cot and silence where a hug should be. Afterward, Margaret was approached by dozens, some young, some her age, some older. One woman in her 80s whispered, You said what I've been too scared to say for years. A man in his 40s hugged her tightly. You made me call my mother. Thank you. Margaret nodded. She didn't need applause. She needed impact. And that she had. Back in Vermont, Lily greeted her at the airport with flowers. You were incredible, she said. Margaret smiled, setting the bouquet on the passenger seat. I didn't faint, so that's a win. Lily laughed, but her voice turned serious. You're changing lives, Grandma. You know that, right? Margaret glanced out the window. I just told the truth. Sometimes, Lily said softly, that's the bravest thing in the world. Weeks passed. Summer faded into the orange rustle of early fall. Margaret began outlining her book, tentatively titled The Coldest Room. A memoir of survival and soft fury. Frances arranged for a publishing connection. Anita offered to proofread. Lily volunteered to design the cover. It wasn't just a book. It was a warning. And a torch. One morning, Margaret received a certified letter. It was from a small law firm in New Hampshire. Inside was a legal notice. Brian had officially transferred power of attorney to a neutral third party. No further claim on her assets. No appeals filed. No objections to her house being sold. The letter ended with a short note. I won't come back. I don't deserve to. But I hope someday you'll believe that I did love you. I just lost my way. Brian. She set the paper down. There was no triumph in it. Just a small, exhausted peace. Sometimes closure doesn't come with fireworks. Sometimes it just comes quietly, signed and sealed. That night, she and Lily walked through the neighborhood park. The trees were just beginning to turn. You know, Margaret said, I used to think strength meant not crying. Lily looked over, curious. And now I think it means crying and continuing. Lily smiled. That's probably going in your book. Only if you spell check it. That night, she dreamed of warmth. Not sun. Not a fire. But the steady kind. Like a room that belongs to you. Like a chair that holds you up. like a voice calling you by your name, and meaning it. The snow came early that year. By mid-November, Vermont's trees had surrendered their leaves, and the sidewalks sparkled with frost each morning. Margaret Ellis stood at her window, watching the first flakes descend like quiet prayers. She had turned 76 the week before. There was no grand party, no balloons, no sheet cake, just a candle and a lemon muffin, lit by Lily, and a whispered wish Margaret never said out loud. She didn't want much anymore, but she wanted the silence she had fought for to mean something. Justice in silence had grown faster than anyone imagined. In just under a year, it had served over 400 seniors, connecting them to lawyers, safe housing, mental health care, and most importantly, community. Margaret was no longer just the face of the organization. She was its heart. Anita ran the hotline now, calm and sharp as ever. Marie handled volunteer outreach. And Lily, brilliant Lily, balanced college classes with nonprofit management like she was born for it. Margaret no longer tried to do everything herself. That was something she'd had to learn. "I can lead without carrying it all," she wrote in her journal. "I can rest without retreating." The book, The Coldest Room, was released just after Thanksgiving. A modest first run, mostly regional. But it resonated. Readers wrote in by the dozens. "I gave it to my neighbor. She left her son's house the next day. I read it out loud to my mother in hospice. She cried for the first time in weeks. This isn't just a memoir, it's a mirror. Thank you." One morning, Margaret appeared on a national morning show. The hosts were kind, the lights were bright, and her pearl earrings caught the cameras perfectly. When asked what the hardest part had been, she answered without hesitation. Not the garage. Not the cold. Not the silence. The hardest part was realizing that love doesn't guarantee kindness. The segment went viral. In December, the team launched their most ambitious project yet. A scholarship and legal aid fund in Margaret's name, targeted at low-income seniors facing abuse or displacement. They named it the Margaret Ellis Fund. At the press conference, Margaret stood behind the podium, her gray blouse freshly pressed, her voice clear. "This fund is for the quiet ones. The ones who didn't scream but endured. Who were told they were imagining things. Who spent holidays in basements or garages or back rooms while others toasted in warmth. You are not invisible. We see you now." The applause didn't fade quickly. Neither did the tears. That night, Lily handed Margaret a small black box. Inside was a custom-made brooch, a silver feather wrapped in a circle. "For resilience," Lily whispered. "For all the times you stayed standing." Margaret touched it gently. "I never wanted any of this," she said. "I know," Lily replied. "But you turned pain into purpose. That's more than most ever do." Later that evening, Margaret sat at her desk. She opened the drawer that had once held letters she'd never sent. Most of them were gone now. Released. Processed. Or simply no longer needed. All that remained was the letter to Lily, still carefully folded. She opened it, read it, and smiled. She had already said all those things now, out loud. In actions. In trust. She placed the letter in the recycling bin. It was time for new words. She began writing her next book. Not a memoir. A guide. How to protect yourself without losing yourself. A survival book for elders. The first line read, "They will say you're imagining things. Believe yourself anyway." Christmas came quietly. Margaret spent it with Lily, Anita, Marie, and a handful of seniors who had nowhere else to go. They decorated a small tree in the Justice in Silence office. The ornaments were handmade, mismatched, full of stories. One was a ceramic angel. Margaret didn't ask, but she knew Lily had taken it from her apartment. It belonged there now, with all the other symbols of quiet survival. On New Year's Eve, Margaret stood outside just before midnight, wrapped in a wool coat, watching snow drift from the sky. The world was still. Just the crunch of her boots on the walkway, the distant hum of laughter through windows, and the cold air brushing her cheeks like memory. She thought of the garage, not as a trauma but as a mile marker. She had been broken there, then reassembled. Not the same. Better. Sharper. Clearer. At 12:01 a.m., Lily came outside and hugged her from behind. "We made it," she said. Margaret smiled. "Yes," she said. "We did." And when she looked up, snowflakes fell on her face. They didn't feel cold anymore. They felt like grace.